I'm nervous about speaking to this group, right? So I'm a teacher, and I'm teaching classes in like basic biology, and these are students who don't know anything. Not that that's an insult, but why would they take the class if they already knew it, right? So it's easy because I know that stuff. But when I look out at an audience like this, by the way, this is the most intelligent and handsome looking audience I think I have ever seen today so far. So the challenge for me really is to address this audience, because I'm used to whatever I do, and tell you stuff that, I mean, let's face it, if you're here at the Institute, you have a certain level of interest in all that kind of stuff in the sciences or natural history. And so you're probably a much better informed audience than your average bear, right? So I'm going to tell you some stuff that maybe you already know or know something about, but I'm going to try and make it at least interesting and informative. There's people up there. Oh, God. Oh, I got your email. Sorry. I'll get back to you. So what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is my story a little bit. Bob's a big fan of stories. His story is much more entertaining. So like, why am I involved in this kind of thing? A little bit about my research interests. And then I want to try to make the connection that's like, well, why should it be that we all recognize how we're somehow connected to the marine world, the marine realm? What's that got to do with us? Especially here, central Arizona highlands, sort of a desert. What's the ocean got to do with me? Right? And then a little basic oceanography stuff, some natural history, and if I don't talk too long, I'll talk about a little case study where we can compare the Gulf of California to the Red Sea, which is something I have recently kind of thought about. I have good news and I have bad news, okay? So first, the bad news is I'm going to be talking for the next 45 minutes. Right? The good news is 45 minutes from now, you won't have to listen to me anymore. So the motivation for me to give this talk has to do with, in the most immediate or proximate motivation for that, has to do with a recent experience I had as a faculty member on the spring 2023 semester at sea voyage aboard this ship, the World Odyssey. Semester at Sea is a study abroad program. It's in its 60th year, and it uses a ship as a traveling college campus, with sometimes as many as 600 students, dozens of faculty, an enormous ship's crew, and the mission of Semester at Sea, there's our ship from the other side, is pretty simple. To provide students with these journeys of discovery that spark bold solutions to global challenges. And what better way to do that than to take students all over the world and see stuff, right? And it sort of dovetails with the mission of Prescott College, which has a kind of a similar spirit to it. So this voyage began around January the 5th in the port of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And we traveled from there to something like 11 different port cities and plus or minus 15 different countries, depending on side trips. Our first port, as I said, was Dubai, which is where we staged from and did orientation. And from there, we left through the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, into the Arabian Sea. Whoops, let's go back for a second. Wrong button. Into the Arabian Sea, which you can see down there. And then to the coast of India, to the city of Mumbai, which I picked these two pictures. I've got a million pictures, but what are you going to do? And from Mumbai, we traveled across the entire Indian Ocean to the port of Mombasa in Kenya, with many side trips. Saw some animals like that, as well as coastal zones. And then from Mombasa, we went around the edge of that Horn of Somalia on Africa and up into the Red Sea, and then up the Gulf of Aqaba to Aqaba, Jordan, where we had other side trips. Like here you see like Petra on the left, which is probably a pretty famous scene from various movies, and in this spectacular desert at Wadi Rum. If you saw the picture of me on the camel, it was somewhere in there. I don't really think camel riding is my forte. After this, we continued up the Red Sea through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, where we had port stops at Cyprus. And every time we did a port stop, there was like 5 or 6 days to do field trips and excursions. From Cyprus on into Greece, the port of Piraeus, which is the Athens port. And then since our ship's captain was Greek, we seemed to go around in circles a lot in the Greek islands. From there, we went up into the Adriatic to the port of Dubrovnik in Croatia, which is, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you would have loved it there. And then back down around the tip of Italy and up to the coast of Spain to Barcelona, and spent some time there. From there, it was out through the Straits of Gibraltar and around onto the west of North Africa to Morocco and the city of Casablanca, which is a place I would advise you to never try and drive in. Looks peaceful in this scene right here. And in fact, when we were there, it was Ramadan. And so it was really an incredible experience in a lot of different ways. I wish I could do a whole talk just on this trip, but this is just the intro. So after leaving Morocco, we went up the Atlantic to the coast of Portugal, where we stopped in Lisbon. This is a famous sculpture, the Prince Henry the Navigator thing, with all of these people on the side of it that are various explorers over history. And, spent some time in Lisbon. And in general, the way this worked on the ship was that students were taking a full spectrum of liberal arts courses. They had art, history, economics, language, music, and some science classes as well. And we were generally at sea for 5 to 7 days, and that's when students were in class like normal students, like lectures and quizzes and discussions and stuff like that. But then when we would hit port for 5 to 6 or 7 days, everybody would scatter and go on to various tours, field trips, field courses, some of which were highly organized, some of which were highly disorganized. And then my job was to teach coastal ecology, coastal environmental ecology, and oceanography, which was a hit, of course, because we're on a ship. So, and I was the only kind of sciencey guy, so it's not that I was popular, but those classes were popular. And rightfully so. You're on a ship. Why not study the ocean? So I spent a lot of time on this ship. You can see the route we covered. I can't tell you how many thousands of miles it is because where's my laser? Oh, this is so cool. Like just right in here, we probably put on an extra 5,000 miles because the captain was Greek. And so every little island he would like to pull into and order coffee or something. We couldn't leave the ship, but the captain could like order out. And, people would bring things to him. That's what I think was going on. So spending a lot of time on the ship kind of motivated me to think and reflect about what was my particular journey in terms of I can say, hey, I'm a marine biologist. Wow, that's cool. How did I get to this? What have I been doing? What do I know? I've been a student of marine biology, marine ecology, oceanography, studying and thinking about this for a long time. And I started thinking, how can I sum this up? and what do I know anyway? What have I learned? And really, as a teacher in class, it was a matter of trying to decide what is important to know. Like, if you only have a little bit of time to get something across to a group of students, what do they need? What should you tell them? And I've done a lot of stuff, I've been on boats, little boats, medium-sized boats, big boats, ships. I've been on the water, in the water, under the water, snorkeling, scuba diving, measuring stuff, doing samples and chemistry and seawater stuff and looking under rocks and tide pools, like Bob said, pointing out starfish and worms and little squishy things and teaching like that for a long time. So I started to think, I kind of know a lot of stuff. On the other hand, you know, when you're out there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it's big, you know? And then when you've got lifelong learners and students on the ship, like this guy, Captain Rick, who is a crab boat fisherman from Alaska. He's been on that Most Deadliest Catch TV show, you know? This guy's sitting into my class. So he actually treated me like I knew something. Now, what he knows is something else that's much more real, in my opinion. So it started me thinking, well, yeah, maybe I actually don't know all that much. And there was one point on this voyage where I was introduced to a group of visitors that came on the ship at a port. And somebody introduced me, and one of these people said, oh, you must be the oceanographer. And I was like, this, you know, oh, yeah, they're talking to me. So I realized, yeah, that's, you know, I'm the oceanographer. I hadn't even thought that way before. I didn't really think of myself that way before. And then that was unfortunate, because at that point I realized I better know my stuff, and or I'm going to get called on it. So I wanted to kind of share a little bit of like my journey to get to this place. Really what this is it's an attempt to answer this question. What is a marine biologist or an oceanographer doing in the middle of Arizona? I've been asked that question a lot ever since as an undergraduate and in grad school. So what my little story here is about is, you know, how am I connected to the marine world, which is maybe a little bit unfair and obvious, but I'm hoping to expand that to like, well, how are we all connected, right? So when I was a kid, I moved from the land of Oz in Kansas to the Southern California coast, Palos Verdes Peninsula. And so as a kid, like between the ages of like 7 and, I don't know, 18, 19, I lived on the coast, and the ocean was a part of my life all the time. All the schools I went to as a kid, junior high, high school, were on cliffs overlooking the ocean. They were beautiful. I mean, I was so lucky as a kid. I can't even believe it to this day, but still, that influences you. And then in the summers, it's like going to the beach, body surfing, getting slammed and beat up and all that stuff. I knew surfers. There were surfers around my world, but they were some strange other species, you know? They were weird and dangerous. I was a little afraid of them. It turns out that those guys are pretty sharp. And so I learned to surf about 10 years ago. And I wouldn't call myself a surfer. I'm a guy who gets up on a board and then falls down. But I've come to recognize that the surfers, the surfing community, are people that know a lot of marine natural history. They know what's going on with currents and rips and seafloor topography, waves, tides, and all that stuff. And so they contain a lot of knowledge. If you've ever seen the book Barbarian Days, it's a worthwhile read and has some great descriptions of oceanography in it. You know, when I was a kid, I was exposed to those Cousteau specials and National Geographics and all that stuff. I ate that stuff up. But I was actually more interested in outer space, and I wanted to be an astronaut. Oh well, that didn't work out so well. So it wasn't really until like my second year of college, I was an engineering student at UCLA, so I never saw the outside. I was in the room studying physics, chemistry, calculus, astronomy. That was fun. But you know, you could stay in one building for your whole life as an engineer. I went on a trip with a friend of mine to the northern Gulf of California, in Rocky Point, Puerto Penasco. And it was during that trip that I recognized an opportunity to actually study outdoors and work and be like a marine person or whatever, do any kind of natural history and ecology in the field as an outdoor kind of sciencey kind of guy. And while I was there with this group, Penasco, by the way, up there it is. While I was on this trip, we ran into a group of students that were in an ichthyology class from University of Arizona in Tucson. And I discovered 3 things that really changed the entire direction of my life after that. One, I found out that there were such things as field trips and field courses, something that engineers didn't do, right? I got totally turned on to intertidal ecology as a sort of a discipline of study. And then I saw that there was a community of students and scholars and like-minded people that were having a really good time, like fun, doing field research, studying natural history and ecology. They have this intellectual camaraderie, and one of their mottos was work hard, play hard. And these people would go out all day in the tide pools or whatever they did, killing fish and stuff like that. And then at night, they kind of had some fun. So as a response to this, I decided I wanted to change. I moved colleges. I moved from California to Arizona. This is where people started asking me, like, wait, so you lived in Southern California.
Yeah, right.
You moved to Arizona to study marine biology.
That's a good question.
And so, anyway, I began exploring the Gulf of California, Baja, and Sonoran Coast, and looking into marine biology and intertidal ecology. I was as field research, as a teacher, and now here it is. It's almost 50 years later, and I'm still doing the same damn thing, which is walking around in tide pools looking under rocks. Well, it's a living. So, I hope I'm on the right slide. Anyway, what is it about intertidal ecology anyway? What is intertidal ecology? So the intertidal zone, you all know, on the shore where the tide goes out and leaves exposed these big areas of intertidal. It's like getting a peek at the bottom of the ocean. Rocky intertidal zones are great places for field research. Much of what we know about ecological theory and ecosystems has its sort of roots in the terrestrial world. So we know a lot about terrestrial stuff. Marine ecology is a little different, but any good field science like this should develop models, theories, understandings of the systems that apply, whether it's terrestrial or marine, right? So rocky intertidal zones have become a pretty important place for people to test out ecological theory about all kinds of processes like, competition, predation, mutualism, succession, patterns of diversity, impacts of climate change, all those kinds of things. So we study those in different environments, and hopefully our models of ecosystems will apply across terrestrial and marine. So check it out. Here's the intertidal zone. It's great. This in Penasco and here in Lobos, when the tide goes out, you've got like 20 feet of vertical change in the sea level, exposing hundreds of meters of tide pools and rocks and slimy things. Another thing about the intertidal zone and intertidal ecology that's great is that if you want to study something, let's say like plant community structure as it relates to changing habitats, you go to Tucson, you start up in the upper Sonoran, down in Tucson, you drive up the Catalinas to 10,000 or whatever it is feet, and you go through all these life zones. There's oak, pinyon, juniper, and then ponderosas, and I don't know all these trees. They're not my deal, but there's trees. There's big trees, right? And so you see all this transition, ecosystem transition, community structure, and all the factors that go along with it over a course of maybe 10,000 vertical feet of elevation and many miles driving or walking up the mountain. Well, check this out. This place, you get all of that action happening in about 100 meters, right? From high tide to low tide, it might only be 10, 12 feet of vertical elevation. So that's ease of access. Being an intertidal ecologist puts you in good company with some famous people like Steinbeck and Ricketts, and maybe even Aristotle. He kind of dabbled around in the tide pools. But you don't have to get wet. That's one of the best things. You don't need a ship. You don't have to go risking your life with sharks. You get to poke around in the tide pools. And what I think is most important is that there's a thing going on in places like this on rocky shores and other kinds of intertidal zones where I think what's happening is a form of ecological compression. Everything that you see happening on that mountainside with all the trends and biology and physical factors and all that stuff, in a place like this, it's happening very tight in a compressed space, and so it's sort of like an exaggerated microcosm of ecosystems. So you can observe, for example, these rocks that these people are measuring, they were working for me, by the way. Those rocks are covered with barnacles and stuff, and I had study sites that were this big on some of these rocks. Okay, this is my study site. Pretty bitchin', right? So you can do all kinds of work in small scales. Temporal scales, spatial scales allows us to see ecological phenomena playing out and it's cheap too, because all you got to do is get to the shore. And the other advantage is when it's low tide, you're working, right? But when it's high tide, you can't work. So that's when you goof off. Anyway, as a young PhD student in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Tucson, at U of A, I was armed with a bachelor's degree in zoology, a love for intertidal ecology. I had published a paper on intertidal zonation. I thought I was pretty cool. And so I just happened to show up in the right place at the right time as a student when there was this natural and dramatic, catastrophic population crash of a particular species of sea star, Heliaster, this guy. That's the back, this is a little one, and it's upside down there, it's eating a snail, right? This is a top predator. And their population crashed rapidly and extensively, almost 100%, like local extinction throughout the Gulf of California. And I just happened to be there when this was happening, along with other people. This species of animal was well known. Heliaster had been studied by other famous folks, people well known in the field, and it had a name in the literature, and it had been referred to as what they call potentially a keystone species. And that is an organism that has a huge impact on its ecosystem because it eats other things and keeps them from killing each other, and it can allow for big, complex, diverse communities to coexist. So this is a theory, this is an idea that maybe Heliaster is one of these guys. But you see there's the two examples of the food web where this animal is at the top of the food web and it's eating a whole bunch of creatures. I just happen to have a bunch of baseline data on this because as a nerdy undergraduate, we thought it was fun to go to Penasco and count everything. So I have data on almost all of the species you see on these food webs, population densities, intertidal distributions. So I had numbers on the Heliaster itself and a bunch of its prey, its competitors, other organisms that lived in the same intertidal community. So it was obvious what to do. You have the removal of a top predator that's been claimed to maybe be a keystone, and the expected result is an ecological collapse. So the work I did in the following years, all these marine invertebrates, centered around looking at community structure and what the roles of complexity and diversity are in the stability and resilience and maintenance of ecological communities. All right? That sounds cool, doesn't it? The other subtitle for this was Global Warming Causes AIDS in Starfish Leading to Ecological Collapse. But that one didn't catch on. I thought it would be fundable, but it just didn't work. So here we have the removal of a top predator and a setup for a natural experiment. So it turns out that it wasn't quite a keystone, but it wasn't a simple case of, it wasn't black and white. Now the other dimension of this that's interesting is that this other graph here, which is, these are all little deviations of sea surface temperatures from the mean. So when you see a bumpy thing going down here, that means those months were below average temperature, right? And you see like up here, those are bumpy, elevated sea surface temperature periods. It turns out that it's thought that the cause of this die-off is this period right here. Warm winter temperatures, which allowed the epidermal flora, which is viruses, fungi, bacteria, protozoans, on these sea stars, this guy, they have an epidermis. Those critters got out of control, and it led to an epidermal disease that pretty much wiped out the whole population. I've been studying them since, and I have data. They have like rebounded, but in some places they haven't. So you have a temperature event that triggers the die-off of a major predator. What happens to everybody else? So I looked at the structure of these systems, and it was a complicated story. Some things got more abundant, some things less. Different competitions happened. There's a whole talk there, but not today. However, I do have to say that this work was picked up by this character here, Murray Gell-Mann. Gell-Mann is a worldwide known physicist, discoverer of the quark, okay? One of the fundamental particles of nature. He wrote this book called The Quark and the Jaguar about complex systems. And he happened to put my research in it for my PhD. I didn't know this, okay? So it's a long story. But this guy's pretty well, he's a smart guy, okay? He's a smart guy. So I get a copy of the book. It says, to Ed Boyer, I like this part, whose work I admired and quoted without knowing who did it. All right, now, this is priceless. I take this to every faculty evaluation. And I point this out. Murray Gell-Mann, smart guy, right? All right. He admired my work. I like that. That's probably going to go on my gravestone. Anyway, what's that?
He was a Nobel Prize winner.
He won the Nobel Prize in physics. I mean, come on. Anyway, so since this time, I've been studying marine ecology and oceanography all over the Gulf of California and elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. I came to Prescott College in 1992, hired to run their newly acquired field station in Keno Bay and start up a marine studies program, which is going on now. So, that's my connection, right? Now, it turns out that the Gulf of California is a place where a lot of other people do work. California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas have all had long-term regular visits to the Gulf of California for field trips with different classes. Of course, a lot of Mexican institutions all over Sonora and Baja do as well. But we get visitors from far-flung places. And some of the key points to look at here are in the northern Gulf, Puerto Penasco, Lobos, Libertad, and then Keno Bay are more of the areas where I'm familiar with, although I've done stuff all over the place. And there's field stations at these places. There's field stations in El Golfo, here in LA Bay, up here in San Felipe, down here in La Paz, and down here in Guaymas. So there's a series of field stations throughout the Gulf of California where all kinds of different people take students or do research. Our place in Keno Bay has just, when was it, a year or two ago, celebrated its 30th anniversary as a field station. So we have all kinds of field events going on there, long-term, short-term classes, researchers, all kinds of programs, and you can check it out on the Prescott College website. It's one of my favorite places. Unless you get chased by bees, then this is a great place to camp out. All right, so that's the Keno Bay Center. All right, I'm going to move on. So I want to talk now a little bit about, well, what about the rest of us, or what about everybody? What should everybody, how is it possible that people are connected to the marine realm, no matter where you are or what you do, right? This is the question. And so I pose this question. And there is a quiz coming up, so please make sure you know the magic number. So if we think about, we're shifting gears, right? We need to go global. If we think about the Earth and what's like the average place on the Earth, like a typical place, if you were out in space and threw a big dart and it was going to hit the planet, where would it hit? In the ocean, right? And where in the ocean? The average place in the ocean is like this, okay? You're here, you could be there. This is the bottom of the ocean representing an average place. Now, averages are troublesome, right? I'll tell you a story about averages. These three statisticians go rabbit hunting, okay? You know what I'm talking about? So they've all got their little rifles and they're walking down this dirt trail and a rabbit jumps out. And the first statistician goes, pew, and he says, oh, I missed it, but I was exactly 1 foot too high. And then another rabbit, and the second statistician goes, pew, and he goes, oh, I missed it. I was exactly 1 foot too low. And the third statistician says, we got him. So that's what happens with averages. But anyway, here's the magic number, 3.5. This is now the part of the talk where I have to actually pay attention. The typical place on Earth would be at the bottom of the ocean, in a relatively flat bottom, at 3.5 kilometers deep. It's cold, it's dark, it's salty, it's under tremendous pressure, it's quiet, and it's very still. How cold is it? How cold is it, she asked. Thank you. It's 3.5 degrees centigrade.
Oh,
That's cold.
really, yeah.
How deep is it? 3.5. Yes, 3.5 kilometers. That's the average depth. And the salinity is about 35 parts per thousand, which is 3.5%, right? What's with 3.5? Don't know. The Lord may work in mysterious ways. So this is the kind of average place on Earth. Deep, dark, pressurized, cold, quiet, still, and it's been that way for countless thousands of years, right? It's a different kind of world down there, and yet there's still living things. So, we all know about where we are in the Southwest, right? But our entire, and we know that the whole landscape here is dominated by the Colorado Plateau and the drainage of the Colorado River, which of course goes into the northern Gulf of California. So if we want to talk about connections to the sea, there's an obvious one, right? In fact, if you look at the bathymetry of the northern Gulf, when we say northern Gulf, we mean like around there, a line between Penasco and San Felipe. That area of the northern Gulf, the bottom topography there is flat, it's shallow, and it's muddy, right? Sort of boring. But where did that dirt come from? Grand Canyon. So if you're at the Grand Canyon and you wonder how that big hole got there, and where did it go? You can go to the northern Gulf of California, dive down to the bottom, and look around, and you will see a nice flat plain of thousands of feet thick of sediment. Sort of boring, but there it is. Historic accounts say that before the Colorado was diverted and dammed, when it was flowing hard, people saw plumes of sediment laden, the color of the water, as far south as La Paz. So, you know, it's possible that one of the names for the Gulf Sea of Cortez, the Vermilion Sea, may have something to do with that coloration of the sediment load in the water. And the delta, of course, which today is, you know, it's a changed world. Flow there is almost zero most of the time. But the delta has been described in some great literature at the time when it was a real thriving kind of habitat as extremely diverse and rich environment. And you can read about that stuff. So even here, right, where we are, central Arizona highlands, our weather and climate are influenced by the ocean, right? Pacific, Gulf of California, and even the Gulf of Mexico. So it turns out that winter weather that we get with winter rain, a lot of that flow is coming across from the Pacific, moving eastward across. And that's our winter rains. And that's also driven or connected to the jet stream. The jet stream, you guys all watch the weather, the jet stream is affected by the El Nino phenomenon. So this year we're in an El Nino event, and that has the effect of bringing the jet stream lower, which might mean for us maybe a wetter winter, more snow, whoopee, right? Summer patterns are different, right? So a lot of summer weather flow for us, the monsoons, are coming up from southeast, is that right? Yeah, flowing up towards northwest from the Gulf of California, but to a certain extent even from the Gulf of Mexico, with flow going this way. So the monsoon season in the southwest is influenced by the moisture and the winds and the humidity that's coming from those seas. One other factor that connects us in terms of weather and climate, you know, when there's hurricanes in the eastern Pacific around coming up the Mexican mainland, up through the Gulf of California, or on the Baja coast, even though those are hundreds of miles away, we get the weather from those things, right? We've all experienced it. We get overcast, we may get rainfall from a hurricane that's centered way down here somewhere. And the hurricanes are a very oceanic-driven kind of phenomenon because of heat. So I think that's kind of interesting, whatever. The broader weather and climate picture, of course, even in our region, is influenced by global climate change. And global ocean currents and wind patterns have a big impact on weather all over the planet. So here's oceanography class stuff. When we look at the way our global climate system works, kind of start with wind. So the prevailing winds over the planet, you know, it's really caused by heating of air masses that flow up high altitude and then tend to move away from the equator into higher latitudes where they cool and then they fall back down. That's kind of a simple version of this. This is a great figure to look at. It takes a while to really get it. But as those air masses are moving, rising up, they're dragging air across the surface of the ocean. And when that air moves across like that, it gets deflected by the dreaded Coriolis effect. If you know Coriolis, you should be glad that I'm not going to try and explain it. So that's the effect of the apparent bending of things in different hemispheres in different directions. So as that wind flows, it gets deflected and bent, and we end up on the right-hand side with these sort of circular or bent wind patterns, like so. And this is what gives rise to the trade winds, the westerlies, easterlies, northeast trades, and all that stuff. But it's those winds that are driving surface currents on the Earth. So the oceanic currents are wind-driven, long periods of prevailing winds, which are not like fast, but they're steady. It starts to drag surface currents around. So you have surface currents of, as you can see from like some of these current maps, things like the Gulf Stream and the currents around in the Atlantic. And then on the other side, you see all these global gyres, the big circular currents that are going around in the middle of most oceans. They have a pretty similar pattern, right? You see this pattern, and then the opposite, flowing in opposite directions and opposite sides of the equator. The red represents warmer water, the blue is colder water, right? So even here in Arizona, boink, these cold currents that are coming down California coast actually have an impact on the weather that we get. An interesting thing to look at is this guy, the Antarctic circumpolar current. So if we looked at the Earth from the bottom, south, you'll see that it's the only place on the planet where there's unbroken oceanic pathway all around the entire circumference at like high latitudes, 40s, 50s, 60 south latitude. So what that means is that this stream of water, these currents, are flowing pretty much free without any obstructions for perhaps like 13,000 miles. And as things like this, as these currents pass between South America and the Antarctic and the Drake Passage, it's been estimated that volume of surface flow is something like 4 billion cubic feet per second. So we know Colorado River stuff, some people, right? It's, what is that, like 10,000? 15,000, 10,000 CFS. This is 4 billion. It's been estimated that that's like having 600 Amazon rivers flowing through that spot. So coastal currents that we see there on these coasts affect coastal climate. Upwelling, which is when nutrient, cold, rich water comes up from underneath, bringing nutrients and oxygen and stuff, that's a coastal phenomenon for the most part. And that water fuels some of the greatest fisheries along the continental shelves. When there's an El Nino event, here and here, those upwellings and those currents change. And in a severe El Nino event, those upwellings can fail altogether, which results in all kinds of failures in fisheries, in addition to all the climate stuff. So, okay, enough of that. Another weird thing about this is like the fun stuff, like, oh, cool, ocean, right? A little known thing about water movement in the ocean is what's called thermohaline circulation. It's the movement of giant, slow-moving, deep water masses moving around the Earth in very complex pattern. So what's happening here is waters that are up here, especially here, this one's been well studied around Iceland. Waters near the North Polar Zone they're getting cold, right? As the seawater gets cold and it begins to freeze out, it's the freshwater part of it that becomes ice. And what's left behind as it freezes is very cold, increasingly salty water. When water gets cold, it gets more dense. When it gets saltier, it gets more dense. So as water in those regions gets cold, it sinks, actually sinks. So this is, a thing to think about in the ocean. There's water flowing through water. It's like a stream going through another stream. There's eddies, there's upwelling, downwelling, all kinds of stuff. Well, what this does is it generates these giant water masses, deep water masses, sometimes called bottom water. And these things can travel for centuries, these water masses, over thousands and thousands of miles to reemerge somewhere else. Now, what's shown in this diagram is the dark blue is the cold water. As it gets sort of green, it's less cold, and then as it starts to mix and come closer to the surface, it turns more into these reddish colors. So these are masses of water that have characteristic signature profiles, and they can be identified. For example, we look at density, temperature, salinity, pH, oxygen content, and various nutrient profiles. And you can profile, imagine a giant blob, a big blob of water, right? At the bottom of the ocean, creeping along, kind of like blob, like this. Moving along, some of these masses maintain their integrity anywhere from 200 to 300 years to as much as 1,600 years as a mass of water. And then traveling thousands of miles to even come up on the opposite pole, more or less. There's all kinds of implications there, because that water is like a historic record. We can be looking at a water mass emerging from somewhere and know that it went down underwater hundreds of years ago. And it may contain records of things like what was CO2 content back then, for example. And so just to give you a sense of some currents, a surface current that we talked about before might be moving around 1.5 centimeters per second. It's hard to imagine what that means. Upwelling and downwelling is like much slower, like maybe a meter a day, water moving up. It's slow. And this thermohaline, salt, temperature-driven circulation is flowing around the order of 1/100th of a centimeter per second. So you got these huge blobs of water creeping along the bottom of the ocean. Makes you kind of sleepy. Okay, it's getting that time in the talk. All right, I'm going to move along here. So I was going to talk to you a lot about chemical properties of seawater, but I think I'll skip a bunch of that stuff and get to the point, which is that because of the properties of seawater, it has tremendous amount of heat capacity, more than you might think. It can absorb lots of heat without changing temperature, which may not make sense to you, but you'll have to trust me on that one. It has to do with the bonding in the H2O molecules to each other. It turns out that heat capacity for seawater is something like 1,000 times higher than it is for atmospheric air. Wow. Well, if we start thinking about temperature and climate change, it starts to become obvious that the oceans are a tremendous sink and buffer to regulate temperature change. They're slow to change. But temperature, this is something I've learned recently, temperature also affects the density of seawater. Warm things rise, warm things expand. Warm things are less dense. Yeah, they take up more space. It turns out that seawater expands when it gets warm. Not much, just a little, but let's face it, there's lots of seawater, right? So there's a thing here, I better not go there. There's a thing called global mean sea level, GMSL, right? And people are calculating how that changes over time. And there's another thing I love this one, global mean thermospheric sea level change, which is about how much is sea level changing because of temperature. And these have been measured. So in one study that looks at the period of 1971 to 2018, that's almost 50 years, what was found is that of the whole sea level rise in that period, it's not much. It's like 0.15 to 0.2 meters of rise. Half of that is due just to the expansion of water. It's not the melting of the glaciers. Melting of glaciers, big deal, all right? I'm not putting it down. But what we have to consider is that as oceans heat up, they actually expand. The volume of seawater gets bigger and sea level can go up. And then on this slide, one thing you'll see is that there's talk in here about density and components of seawater, but over here, carbon dioxide, which of course we want to be concerned with. In the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is like 0.03, 0.04% of the air. In the ocean, it's about 15% of dissolved gases. That's like 40 to 60 times as much. And if you know anything about carbon dioxide, I'm sure you all do, right? The bicarbonate buffer reaction, you know that one? So when you put CO2 into water, it goes through all these chemical reactions into different forms. And what that means is that seawater can take a large amount of dissolved CO2, but it also turns that CO2 into other things. The net effect of that is that it's not just 40 to 50 times as much CO2, it might be as much as 1,000 times more CO2 holding capacity because of the chemical transition into these other forms. Well, another thing about CO2 is that it's what controls pH. So it turns out that the chemical reactions, if you're interested in this, you can look it up, it's kind of cool, but the chemical reactions for CO2 and water, it's a whole series of reversible reactions in an equilibrium, are the exact same ones that you have in your blood, in your plasma, to regulate your pH in your body. Your CO2 drives your pH. You breathe it off to regulate pH. It goes through the same chemical reactions that we find in the ocean. So CO2 is connected to pH, the acidity of the oceans, and that in turn, of course, is affecting all kinds of life forms and what they can do in their metabolism and such. So let's move on to something else. So regardless of where you live, whether inland or along coasts, I've been saying this all along, right? We're somehow connected to the marine realm. One other way that we're connected is through resources. Continental shelves, shallow coastal zones are some of the most productive environments on Earth for fisheries and fossil fuels and all kinds of things. And, a lot of what we use in terms of supply chain stuff is coming across the ocean. Shipping is like where it's at in terms of things getting around the world. It seems like it ought to be airplanes, but it's not. And you can see on this thing how coastal zones are major places of human habitation and have been since prehistoric and even maybe pre-modern human times. The top 10 cities on this list, a good chunk of them are not just coastal, but on estuaries, on river mouths. Historically, of course, rivers, transport, and that's where you would settle. Something like 95 million people in America live in coastal zones. That's a big chunk. It turns out that coastal deserts are an important type of habitat for people, although it seems like why would you want to live there? But there's these two charts you might take some time to look at. Coastal population on the right shows you in the color zones which nations have higher proportions of coastal populations. The one on the left is showing, on the bottom, is showing growth, projected growth. So the way we measure what's a coastal zone, there's two ways. How far it is from sea level. This is using a 2-meter mark, within 2 meters of sea level. And the other way is how far inland from the coast. It's often like 100 to 150 kilometers. People use different definitions. The message here, though, is that there are lots of people in coastal zones within a couple meters or within 100 kilometers of the coast. And coastal deserts are an enormous part of continental margins. Something like 1 billion people worldwide live in deserts, and many of those are coastal deserts. So what does that mean? Well, considering the impacts of sea level change, human climate-driven migrations are something to be wary about. It's not some futuristic, scenario. This is stuff that's happening now. Island nations, low-lying coastal zones are being affected by sea level change, as we probably all know that. All right, my last little point here about your connection, all of our connection, is what I'm going to call the evolutionary connection. So a lot of people think that maybe life on Earth started in some kind of warm and calm coastal tidal pool. I like that idea because I'm an intertidal ecologist. But regardless, it's pretty well agreed that life may have had an origin in seawater, certainly in water. And the evidence for that is inside of us. We carry it around. Every one of our cells is full of cytoplasm. Your cells are like little bags of salt water, right? It's a mix of water, salts, nutrients, gases, et cetera, just like the ocean is. So your cytoplasm is a lot like seawater. And of course, your blood, bless you, your plasma, it's very much like seawater. If you've been in the hospital and had an IV drip, what's it called? Saline. It's salty water. It's the same salinity as the ocean. You don't go pumping people full of distilled water. That would be bad. And I told you about the pH balance and the CO2. So as a guy with a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology, I kind of like this idea. We're connected to the sea in that kind of a way. All right, wow. I'm sorry, but I'm just have so much left to do. But I want to talk a little bit about some non-sciencey kind of just general natural history and ecology, observational stuff about the ocean, right? Most of us experience the ocean like this, standing on the shore, watching waves, or being in the waves and being beaten to death, right? So we know a bit about waves and we see them from the shore, but there's all kinds of interesting things we can observe about the ocean. Like, look at the patterns on this picture. It's a relatively simple scene, nothing dramatic happening here, but when we start to take it apart, what you're seeing is almost a checkerboard pattern that's the result of maybe 2 or 3 different sets of wave trains intersecting each other at different angles. So you get this complex sort of graph paper, whatever you want to call that. Plus, you see these streaks and these patches, right? When you spend a lot of time on the sea, you're looking at all this stuff and you're reading a story that's basically written by the wind. It's the wind that does a lot of this work of creating these patterns. A perfectly calm sea is pretty rare, but if you're in a coastal, like in a harbor or in a protected bay, you might see these days where the water is flat, like a small lake, and mirror calm. In the open ocean, that's not that common of a sight, but it's a good place to start with understanding. When you have water like this, very glassy, oily looking, but the tiniest ripples are the place where the wind can start to get some kind of purchase on the surface and begin the whole process of developing these patterns. Scientists, oceanographers like to use this couple of systems to describe sea states. This is the Beaufort scale. I like some of the pictures on the bottom right? So on the ship, every day the students had to go out, read the sea, tell me what the scale was. What's the wind? It's a combination of wind and swell height, and whether or not there's white caps or there's blowing foam and such. But you can identify this. There's an international sea state scale, which is similar, where you can say, oh, it's a 6. Most of the time on the ship, we were on a 2 or 3. We were really lucky. Right? Or maybe like this, a 3 or a 4. I mean, on a big ship, that's no big deal. Students are always saying to me, oh man, Dr. Boyer, I want to see like some cool stuff. Like, when's it going to be like a 6 or an 8? I'm like, you're already throwing up, okay? You don't even want to go there. You don't want to be in this picture, okay? They thought that would have been fun. I don't think so. Another way of representing it is, I like this artist conception here. Moderate breeze, I don't know. Strong gale, this is more like your life is flashing before your eyes. So you start off with the sea that's like this. This is the coast of Dubrovnik, Croatia. You can see really nice patterns here. What you're seeing on those little crescents is winds that are coming like this and moving across. And so if you can read the sea, you're seeing all these little wind patterns there, but oftentimes you're seeing other patches that are determined by what's underneath, what kind of seafloor, how deep, and currents that are underneath. And then you get days like this where it's just the right amount of wind, right? So you can, this is Cyprus, this is Limassol, Cyprus. Coming into port here, it's just beautiful, right? Perfect, look at that. It's like a postcard, sailing. Then it gets a little rougher. Here we are going through the Straits of Gibraltar, where it's kind of a decent rough sea, but when you're on a big ship, it doesn't matter. If we were in Kino Bay in our small boats, this would be completely off limits. It's too dangerous, right? Of course, days like this are much worse. I like the top one with the angle, but we don't want to be in this situation. There's another phenomenon that happens with winds where you get these little weird sort of parallel cylindrical patterns of water movement that are driven by winds that are blowing for a long time over the surface, and it creates little convergences like this or divergences like this. And when you see them on the open water, what you're really seeing is things that look like these streaks here, right? So you've got water, you've got waves, you've got different colors, but you have these parallel streaks going. Sometimes they show up a lot better, but those streaks are places where these little things are converging. What happens there is you get piles of foam and debris, and that turns out to be pretty important for a lot of small planktonic marine organisms. Of course, the other thing that's really determining what the sea looks like is color and the sky and the penetration of light. So, you know, when light hits the water, in the very, very top layers of water, almost all of the red is absorbed. It's the blues and greens that penetrate deep. And that's what gives us the general color of ocean water, but it's dominated by the sky. So whatever, you know, it's a reflective deal, but there's also the penetration and scattering of light. So the blues and greens are being scattered. That's one reason it looks blue most of the time. But that does influence how it's going to look. So you combine the chemistry of the water and the way light behaves in water with the surface reflection of the sky, and you get all these different images, right? Beautiful, reflective, calm days. Look at the color of the water, look at the color of the sky, look at the color of the water, the color of the sky. Here in Greece, near the Temple of Poseidon, unbelievably bright, I don't even know what color this is. I think it's blue. But it's that color because of chemical composition and what's in the underlying the water and lots of limestone. This is Greece. This is the kind of ocean color I was used to as a kid. This kind of green stuff, you know, on the beach in Southern California. This is on the coast of Morocco. Or this kind of pale, sort of gray, you know, gunmetal looking. Here again, you're seeing good patterns of different waves, but the color is dominated by the sky in this case. This is actually one of the Greek islands. I never knew there was like big snow-capped mountain peaks coming right down to the coast in the Greek islands, but there it is. And then not too far away, you have this, another Greek island. With the color of the water is just striking, and that has a lot to do with the limestone and the dissolved constituents in the water. Well, I'm going to breeze through this pretty quick, but to get us back to the big picture, when we start looking at the large-scale structure of our planet and the seafloor, the most dominant unifying concept that makes sense of all of it is the idea of plate tectonics and continental drift. And that's looking at the structure of the Earth where we see what was I just showing you? Oh, that. Yeah, where we see the seafloor topography with all of these mountain ranges that run across the seafloor. And there's a great pattern to them. This is one of my favorites, right here. This looks like somebody was blowing on it, you know? In fact, that's kind of true. It's like South America is going so fast this way that some of it's like blowing behind like a scarf in a top-down car, right? But I look at this, Gulf of California, this big range of stuff continues around here. Whee, and look where it goes. Whoa, branches in here. Oh my God, the Red Sea. So when we look at this, these crustal plates on our Earth, we see these, zones where the plates split, run into each other, slide by, etc. And so the Gulf of California has been pretty well studied. The Pacific Rise intersects the Gulf. It's what ripped the Baja off of mainland Mexico, and this is a spreading center that gives the Gulf of California its topography and features. But the same thing's happening here. A spreading center intersecting the African plate, ripping the Arabian plate and the African plate apart, creating a depression that's filled in as the Red Sea. A little closer view, right? Gulf of California has a spreading center right up the middle. It's tectonically active. The Red Sea, same thing. So I don't know, this is kind of a coincidence maybe. Here's another view. So these are interesting bodies of water. And one of the points of all of this is that by studying, for example, marine realms, marine ecology in one area, we can a lot of times, transfer that understanding to other places around the world. And these two bodies of water have some similarities that are worth looking at. So they're both kind of like the same orientation. The Sea of Cortez, about 1,100 kilometers long. It's got this southeast to northwest trend, its shape, right? Narrow, inland, desert surrounded, with a ever deepening rift going down the middle. Average depth is about 180 or so meters, but its maximum depth is about 3,000 meters. And then it goes from around 23 north to 32 north latitude. Well, we look at the Red Sea. It's bigger, but it's the same kind of shape, right? Running from southeast to northwest, same maximum depth, a big rift going down the middle where it's deep. So these bodies of water have a lot of characteristics. Their surrounding desert is important to the biology of these areas, all right? So on this trip, I was able to go up the Red Sea all the way up to the top, where you go to the right, you take a right turn, and you go up the Gulf of Eilat, which leads to Aqaba, Jordan, where the Jordan River flows in. And we're in an area that's like a miniature version of the Red Sea at the end of the Red Sea, like a little baby Gulf of California. Beautiful water, great snorkeling, coral reefs, marine science research station there, where one of the projects they're working on is, why are the corals in this area, it's the northernmost tropical sea in the world, why are these things not exhibiting all this coral bleaching and die-off associated with seawater temperature increase? All right, so this is one of their projects. And it turns out that there's something about that environment that's so extreme that it's thought that these corals may be very, very hardy because they've had to deal with extreme temperature and warm water. And this relates back to the Gulf of California. Both of these seas have coral reefs, extreme temperatures, surrounded by deserts, limited freshwater input, deltas that have been dammed and diverted, and high levels of endemism of species that are found only there. So we can actually transfer some of our knowledge back and forth. One of the projects here in this marine station in Aqaba is to try and figure out what is going on with these corals that allows them to be so temperature resistant, and then maybe transplanting them and whatever it is to figure out how that could maybe help with coral bleaching or other problems. So I'm going to wrap up and say that, well, what do you say after all that? So You know, so places like this, right? Places like the Natural History Institute, Semester at Sea, Prescott College, that foster an engagement with the environment where people really delve into natural history and ecology are critically important for us to have a bigger view and an understanding of stuff that like might seem far away and irrelevant, like what's going on the Pacific coast, Gulf of California, Gulf of Mexico. What's that got to do with us here? But we do have a connection in all these ways I've outlined. And so I think I'm going to quit there, and I want to thank everybody for all of your attention and time. I'm sorry I went so long. Wow.
Thank you, Ed. We do have time for some questions, and we have this mic that we could pass around as long as it doesn't do the feedback thing. And the reason to ask your question into the mic is simply because there is a live stream going on in the audience that's watching probably would be interested in your question.
No further questions.
Were you able to identify the pathogen or pathogens that was doing the number on the starfish?
Well, that's a good question. So my job was to look at the overall community structure response. There are other people who did just that. And what they found out was it was complex. These guys have epidermis. It's thin. And it's just covered with viruses, bacteria, fungi, and protozoans. So it seems like the elevated temperature was like turning their skin into a petri dish. And those populations, it's like having strep throat. Everything gets out of control. In fact, it looked a lot like strep throat. The animals actually dissolved into like white gooey pus, right? Not pleasant. It was called the starfish creeping crud white kill syndrome, right? But it was a host of these microorganisms whose populations got out of control, stimulated by temperature. And these guys don't have much of an immune system. I don't know if that helps. And it does happen occasionally in other places. It's a starfish thing.
So the coral in Gulf of Aqaba, was it?
It's just on it's the Gulf of Eilat, which is sometimes called the Gulf of Aqaba.
Okay, the Gulf of Eilat then. Does not correlate positively to what's going on in the Sea of Cortez?
Well,
I mean, the two systems are alike in
Yes.
shape and form,
yes.
but not in life form.
Well, life forms are similar, the types of corals, the types of fish, not the exact same species, but the general kinds of forms are similar, yeah.
Well, couldn't you then assume that the species in the Gulf of California would be more successful?
More successful than...
Because they're in extreme habitats.
Right. Well, compared to, let's say, open ocean, the Caribbean, for example, which is more broad and open, they might compare favorably there to that group because of their resilience, because the Gulf is pretty extreme. But this Gulf of, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aqaba is even more extreme than that. And it seems that those species they're just super temperature resilient. So I'd say that they're stronger or more resilient than the Gulf of California ones, but I don't know if the same research is happening in the Gulf of California. Not a very good answer, but that's all I got.
In the blobs of extra saline water,
Yeah.
is there anything living in those?
Yes.
What kind? What kind?
Well, deep water masses, mid and deep water masses are things that we never see. They're species of fish, copepods, plankton, squids, all kinds of stuff that live at depths and rarely come up to surface levels. They're living in a world that's dark. And so when people try to figure out what that stuff is, you have to catch it and bring it up. And that's where you see all these weird pictures of these weird lanternfish and those midwater fish with a big mouth, and they're really strange looking. But they don't do well when they're brought up. And so in the early days of studies, everything that you brought up from depth would just explode and just be a mess. So they have to be captured in a certain way to preserve the pressure. But yeah, there are things living in there. Yeah.
You mentioned the durability of some of those blobs. How is that estimated or measured? Are there like isotope measurements or something of
Yeah,
those things?
yeah,
Did you say they're 1,600, they may persist for 1,600 years or so?
Well, that's a good question. So the characteristics, I like the blob. That's a good one. The characteristic of the deep water blobs, you get the whole suite of things, right? Nitrates, phosphates, temperature, salinity, density profiles, gas content, isotopes. So you can identify the water mass, and they have names, these water masses. And then as far as like the time, how old they are, like how do they figure that out? I think a lot of that has been done with just tracking the speed of their movement and estimating how long it takes them to go from point A to point B.
I think we have time for one more question. Here we go.
Okay. How do you sign up for these semester cruises? And do you have to have a certain qualification, or how do you go about that? That list looks fantastic.
Sure. Well, I shamelessly plug Semester at Sea. It's an awesome experience for everyone. It's the best teaching gig I've ever had, and the students were impacted in ways we can't even measure, right? I have to plug the Natural History Institute. It's pretty good, too. Prescott College is pretty good. But to travel on that, I would just go to their website, Semester at Sea, and so there's staff, there's faculty. It's hard to get on as faculty because there's a lot of competition, but there's a whole group of people called lifelong learners. You pay your money, you go on there and you're sort of a student, but you're not required to go to classes, but there's all kinds of activities, and you get to participate in the entire voyage, and it's awesome. I met a lot of folks like you, lifelong learners that just were on the ship because they wanted to go. It's like a giant natural history voyage, and it was just awesome for them. So yeah, there's ways to do it. It's not cheap, I can tell you that, but it's great if you're working on it because then, yeah.
Okay, well, let's give Ed one more hand, please. And as is our tradition at Speaker Series, we do want to give the speaker a Natural History Institute hat. By the way, these are all new, so this might make a good Christmas present.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Ed's going to
It's a
stick around.
bat. It's a bat. Thank you very much for listening. And the slideshow.